Welcome to another episode of Bright Insights, the podcast that leads you to less stress and more success. Here's your host, Paul Bright.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Bright Insights. I am your host, Paul Bright. This episode is R is for restorative practices, and the bottom line up front is restore yourself through nature to better engage with people. Restore yourself through nature to better engage with people. It looks like in the United States we're coming out of this pandemic. A lot more people have gotten vaccinations. The positivity rate is going down in a lot of areas. It means that now us leaders who are used to being around an office full of folks who haven't been around an office full of folks for the last year can return. And this is good news. However, you may not realize this, but some of your people skills, some of the innate ways that your body regulates energy through people have likely diminished. And now that you're going to be around folks for more than 20 minutes and more likely an hour, 2 hours, 8 hours, you got to relearn these things. And my guest that I spoke with, the one I interviewed, Gabriel Kram, knows the best way to do that, and that is to reconnect through nature. And he's written this book, Restorative Practices of Wellbeing. It's coming out now. It's coming out, if it's not out right now as of this podcast, it's coming out very soon. So be on the lookout for it. But he has compiled his 25 years of expertise and a total hundreds and hundreds of years of other experts and put together an outline of different activities you can use involving nature to get yourself regulated. There's a lot of things that we go through that we've had to face during the pandemic, and now that we're coming out, we've got to be ready. We've got to be ready to lead with less stress and more success, and this is one way to do it. So if you feel a little nervous going back into the fray, if you feel a little edgy, even though things are looking good, this is the episode for you. So give this episode a listen. I feel like before the pandemic, employers, businesses, they held value in personal relationships with their coworkers, their colleagues. They held some value to it, but probably didn't realize how much value there was until it was taken away.
The simple answer is yes. I think anecdotally, what I've seen over the last 10 months now, I think people don't realize necessarily, it's like breathing air. Like you don't realize that breathing air until someone cuts off the air supply.
Yeah.
And I think connection is like that.
Yes.
There's a constant nourishing that we're receiving from connections. Just being able to see somebody smile back at you. There's a whole cascade of oxytocin that gets released. And that micro moment in the grocery store when you drop something and someone kind of comes up and they kind of touch you on the arm, they say, "Excuse me, you dropped this." And, that little contact and the reciprocity of that, moment, it's feeding these connection systems. And I think the pandemic, all of a sudden it just took that away, right? Like you can't touch anybody. We don't see anybody's face anymore. And I think, a lot of people, we're seeing a lot of ill-being, increasing ill-being. And I think it's coupled with increasing threat cues, right? So that, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, like I had to stop reading the New York Times because every single article was a crisis. And you have this intersecting dimensions of crisis with the pandemic, and you have this incredible social upheaval that's happening in the country, and you have these ecological crises, and everywhere people turn, there's a threat. And so you all of a sudden you deprive people of that connection, and then you put in more threat, and people's nervous systems tilt defensive. And, you can make this very cogent physiological argument that the stress response is just a defensive response. And so, I think everybody, the entire humanity has experienced a greater level of stress.
Right.
So connection is really the antidote to that. It's the resetting that physiology in the direction of safety and connection.
Yes.
So that's really what we're focused on.
Right. And I'm in the mode now where I want folks to prepare to reconnect physically because of the
Yeah.
vaccine, because we're finding different ways. At the beginning of it all, nobody knew what was happening. So the wellness aspect, the self-care aspect was like, well, I used to go to the gym. I used to do this. I used to do this to take care of myself. I used to go hang out with my friends every Friday night, and now that can't happen because nobody knew what they could do, and none of the alternatives seemed pleasing at any moment. But I think as time went on, folks were finding what I would call loopholes. Like, okay, well, I can't go to the gym, but I can start buying home gym equipment. I can't go with my friends to the movies, but maybe we can set out something up outdoors. I feel like we've started to take that turn, and I think that the more we can prepare, because I don't know that we'll ever get back to a full normal, but the more we can prepare as leaders of sorts is like, okay, how do we do the things we used to do to connect, and what can we do differently now? Now that we've had to get through this to keep connected with our employees, to keep connected with our colleagues.
I think there's this very interesting thing, which is that we're pretty adaptable. I think it's easy to get used to most anything. And it's a weird feature of our biology, right? If you are deprived of something for long enough, if the environment changes, you sort of adapt. And I remember 3 or 4 months in kind of realizing like, there's all these things that I used to do just on the regular to take care of myself that, I go to a coffee shop or I'd, go swimming, or I do these things and I kind of forgot how to do them. I think there's something about socializing also where rapport is a skill. You get into a flow state, you get into a rhythm with somebody in a conversation. And if you don't do that for 9 months, you forget how to be in that ease of social relationships.
Yeah.
And so, I think it's smart for people to sort of treat those as trainable skills that you have to rebuild and remember. Yeah, it's one of those areas where I think the physiology and understanding the way that our body responds to physiological cues just shows up so practically in daily life.
Right. I couldn't imagine before the pandemic. Well, actually, I can, because I remember the news story where I think it was a guy in England. He was doing a live interview, and his kids wandered into the interview.
Right.
And like the mom just dove in and was pulling. I was like, oh my gosh, it was everything. It became like a huge news story. Right. This is the norm now.
Right, totally.
So it's nothing. I've seen the more I've done Zoom meetings with coworkers and other organizations, the more kids I see. And it's like the norm, which I think is, in a way, it's comforting to me. I mean, my kids are older. They would, I don't have that concern.
Right.
But, whereas now I think because supervisors, because coworkers, other organizations, because we've all accepted that this is the norm, I think we're connecting more in a strange way.
I think it's beautiful because it sort of blows through that professional facade, right? That's really one of the things that I am on about, is like these kind of masks of professionalism that just get torn down in that moment where, you're like, oh, that's your cat's butthole. Like,
exactly.
Like, oh, there's a tail. But it's kind of great because I think a lot of that is facade anyway. And it's this kind of humanizing, this kind of equalizing moment of, everybody poops. I mean, like, everybody's got like something going on. It's this, I think, illusion.
Right.
Like, talk about stress. I think so much of that workplace stress is that pressure to present in a certain way and to be professional and to, sort of present this facade. And, I mean, we work with thousands of mental health providers and thousands of people where it's like, look, one of the examples that was very salient in our work for many years is we did a lot of work with, county systems that were in child welfare. And, there would be these interactions between a provider and a client or a child family where the provider was like listening to a story, and in the guise of professionalism, they wouldn't allow themselves to emotionally respond to the story, even though the story was distressing to them, or they wouldn't let themselves have a human interaction. And they ended up leaving the interaction traumatized because they suppressed their natural emotional response. And it was this whole thing of, well, if I showed emotion or distress, it would be unprofessional. But I don't think so. I think the opposite. Like, if you show a distress, it shows that you're humanly connected to this person.
Yes.
And then you don't have to suppress your humanity, and then you don't get traumatized. And the person on the receiving end doesn't feel like they're talking to a robot.
Yes. Even as adults, there are things that have probably happened to us as kids that still hit us today. That was one of my questions I had. I believe that leaders that have past trauma experiences that, they may have symptoms pop up when they get into new leadership roles. And how do they know that that's what it is?
I mean, I think I'll answer it in terms of kind of physiology directly, which is that, generally when something happens, I think we can say that's re-triggering. There's a physiological state change, right? Where we go from sort of feeling like ourselves or feeling, calm or feeling connected to feeling some mode of distress. And it could be irritation that's kind of like on the anger and fight continuum. It could be anxiety continuum. It could be kind of shutdown continuum. So I think the kind of awareness of being, re-triggered, something coming up, is when you sort of realize that you're having a reaction or a response to something and it doesn't quite feel proportional. Right. And I think one of the interesting things about it is that often we don't realize that in the moment, because we'll get kind of swept away in it. But then on reflection later on, you're like, I don't know why I got so upset about that. Right. Or like, right. I wonder what it was about that was so, because you have this very strong reaction and you go, I wonder. And I think that can be just an indicator that your kind of neural platform shifted. You shifted into threat, you shifted into defense. That's, sometimes connected to something that happened a long time ago. And there's this kind of question of how do I, become aware of that, right? There has to be a certain amount of awareness in order to notice that it's happening. And then how do I sort of downshift it? How do I come back to a place of feeling safer? And it's, I think safety is a really critical thing here. And I don't think people think about this in a leadership context necessarily, but distress and threat are responses to not feeling safe. And so, I think it's like, I find myself angry and irritated. It doesn't occur to me that I'm not feeling safe, but yes, that's, what is it that's making me feel threatened? And I have to like go backwards in my mind. Like, what is it that's making me angry and feel like I have to fight? Well, at some point, something happened that I felt threatened by, and my body kind of responded in this way. To kind of backtrack and go, what was it, Gabriel, that made you feel unsafe? Oh, it was the tone of voice of that person, the interaction you had, or whatever it was.
A phrase that they used that used to be like a disciplinary phrase when you were a kid or something like that,
Sure, and it could be anything. I mean, that's the wild thing about it. When I was deeply studying trauma healing, it was like the phrase that often got used was, trauma it's not in the event, it's in the nervous system, and so this kind of physiological cueing where it could be like a smell, it could be, something I'm not even conscious of, right? Like where there's a certain fragrance in the air when something happened when I was a kid, and then that fragrance, I smell it and I start to feel anxious all of a sudden. I don't know why.
Right.
So this is often, there's this physiological process that Dr. Stephen Porges calls neuroception, which is this moment-to-moment detection of safety or threat. And the parts of our nervous system, of our physiology that are responding there, they're not necessarily conscious, and they track back through our felt awareness to even before birth. And so there can be things that happened at a very young age that are still sort of held in the memory. It's not the conscious autobiographical memory. It's more implicit memory in the body. And then, it's a phrase or a turn of phrase or a look someone gives you. And it evokes this memory, this kind of unconscious awareness that causes us to feel a certain threat.
Right.
And we have a reaction.
I feel like sometimes leaders don't realize that the way they're reacting may seem acceptable to them. And it may be from real feelings, from real trauma, but as it comes out, when you have employees, now the employees don't necessarily feel safe. Now the coworkers don't necessarily feel safe because they're reacting to something that didn't make them feel safe. Whereas maybe somebody else who didn't have a traumatic experience that was related to it would brush it off.
Sure. I think in what you're saying, there are 2 points that are super significant. And one of them is just that amplification, the spotlight that's on someone in a leadership role.
Mm-hmm.
Because, everybody's sort of looking to that person for direction, or, I think there's a fair analogy. It's like the when a child is little and they scrape themselves at the playground and they look at mom, and if mom is calm, they're calm, and if mom is like, oh gosh,
Yeah.
you fell, they freak out. They're looking to level set. And I think so therefore the responsibility when we're in those roles is increased. And
Yes.
that's powerfully true. I think it's often, people don't really realize, because it's not where do you learn that dimension of leadership, of embodiment? And I think there are certainly places that are kind of more somatically focused on the somatic facets of leadership, and, that people can learn that, but it's certainly not taught in business school, right? It's like not a curriculum that most people take. So that was one thing. And the other thing I think that's so powerful, the way that the immune system, the histamine response, all of these things are tied together with this autonomic physiology. And so in our work, I think one of the things that is so fascinating is that there's all of these kind of downstream effects of stress, anxiety, depression, sleep disorders, gastrointestinal distress is a huge one, heart problems, autoimmune stuff, that are constantly being misdiagnosed by Western medicine, because they're really phenomena that is a kind of a cumulative result of long-term stress or traumatic exposures. And very rarely does Western medicine actually get back to the source of those.
Okay, here's a part of our conversation where we started talking about my experiences with nature during the pandemic, and Gabriel was able to explain to me some of the experiences and what they likely meant, and how I was not even thinking about it, but nature was working to help heal me already. I didn't realize how much I missed the beach until I went to the beach. I was like, what? Just something was like, you need to go to the water. And again, I was raised in all kinds of places, but we weren't, hunters or gatherers. We didn't go camping or anything like that. My trips to the beach were always with my wife and kids. And they were fun experiences. But as they got older, it was like, oh, nobody wants to really pack all that stuff and go out to the beach and drive an hour, all this stuff. We're all in a different space. But man, weeks after the pandemic hit, I was like, I need to go see some water. I found out we can go see water. And then I was even looking at it, I was like, I don't care who comes with me. I'm going, is what I told folks, which is not my norm. I'm not normally that. I don't take that attitude, but and I just kept getting drawn to it. And it makes sense. And I was reading that piece in your book about being able to walk into the forest. And there's something inside of you with your heart, and how it's almost like this instant magnetism in your heart. Like the animals will know that you're a calm person without, when you get into this zone of awareness, they'll know, they can sense that in you. And it's because that birds have their own languages, and they have their own warning systems, and they're going to call out. If they don't feel you're safe, they're going to call out. And my brother's had that experience as a hunter. He can sit there and tell you, he almost deciphered some of. He told me he could figure out when deer were pretending that they weren't paying attention to you.
Right.
That is neat. Wow.
Yeah, that's really cool.
It's like, that is neat. But it all of that connected. And I was reading this the other morning, and I started getting emotional. I was like, this is why I wanted to go to the beach, because of what Gabriel wrote in here.
There's an elemental intelligence to the living world that's so good for humans. And I love that you listened to that awareness in yourself. When you step out into the living world, you step out into deep nature, be it at the ocean or in a forest, on a mountain, You're stepping back into the harmony of the living world, which is really the baseline state out of which humans emerged. And when you start to really make contact with that at a sensory level, at an embodied level, it's fundamentally reorganizing and re-regulating to the human nervous system. And it's been very gratifying. One of our mentors in nature and culture is a guy named John Stokes. He's run for probably 40 years now this really beautiful tracking school in New Mexico called the Tracking Project.
Oh yeah, I remember talking about that in class. But yeah,
beautiful person, trained by Aboriginal elders in Australia, then came back and worked with the Haudenosaunee, also called the Iroquois Confederacy in upstate New York. And he's for 40 years just been like reconnecting people to the living world. But, the moment that happens, your system sort of plugs back into this ancestral awareness that is really our birthright. But I think modernity has gotten so disconnected from it. And it was really fun. Recently we were on a call with Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who is, now the first Surgeon General of California. And she had developed these recommendations about, initially there were 6 ways of recovering from early adversity. And so her and our work had sort of evolved in tandem with her thinking about that. We worked with her for like a decade ago, and then been in contact with her. But it was like healthy relationships, mental health, meditation, proper sleep, proper exercise, proper nutrition. Those were the kind of 6 things. And then I was on this call with her recently, and they added nature awareness. And I was just like, yes, I was very excited about that. Because that connection with the living world now is becoming documented. It's something that we've been following for a long time in our work, documented as a way to help bring people back into connection, safety and connection, out of that kind of stress physiology.
I can totally see that, because again, in my mind, before I started going to the beach, my mind immediately went to, what do I have to pack? How long is it going to take to get there? How long should I stay there to make sure it was worth the drive? That's normally what my mind is when I think about going to the beach. Who's going to come? Where are we going to eat? Because everybody eats different, But when all this hit, it was just like, you're just going to go and you're going to come back when you're ready to come back. If it's 20 minutes, if it's an hour, whatever. And that's exactly what I did, because I just drove, and there was no public access to the beach, but I kept driving, and then there was an overlook, and that was enough for me. It was just my eyes hitting the water, was enough for me, just looking at it. And then getting outside my car and feeling the breeze hit me in the face was enough for me. And just smelling the sea. And I think I was only there for an hour doing nothing, just looking, getting emotional at the start, and then just looking, not counting birds, or I was just there. And I was like, okay, time to go back. And I drove right back. And he was like, you're already back? I was like, yeah, I just breathed in that sea air, and it was like everything was different. And it didn't take much. And I want to say, and you could probably explore this more, is that if people out there listening that are, in leadership positions or whatever, thinking, oh man, connecting back to nature, that's going to mean getting this camping gear. That's going to mean doing this and doing that. Or I live 4 hours from the nearest nature site. Like, what can people practically do in a nature sense to connect to nature to bring them some wellness?
Yeah, I love the question. I mean, I was going to jump over to our learning platform. I think there's probably 80 practices of nature connection on there, something like that. I mean,
wow.
Something like that. I mean, we've cataloged 350 restorative practices at least. And, I think we cataloged 90 nature awareness practices. And I think your story is so beautiful, because it's like, it's just getting out of the car and seeing the wave set come in. I mean, I'll give you just one simple thing from that stood out to me, is that there's a certain kind of pattern that our nervous system, just in our kind of deep ancestral awareness, has found to be particularly restorative in certain kind of states of distress. And it's a pattern that's characterized by something that has both order and chaos in it. Mm-hmm. And watching the ocean waves is a beautiful example of that. Watching a fire, like a campfire. Watching the way that wind moves across a field or over a forest. There's elements of order and there's elements of chaos, and you can sort of just rest your eyes into it. And it's not like looking at a city. It's not like looking at, something that's man-made. It has this quality that's sort of primally restoring. And you step out and you just smell the salt air and you feel the wind, and there's something that happens in your body that's not like a thinking thing.
Yeah.
It's like the plug, you just like plugging back into this matrix of the living world. John Stokes just talks about that scene in Avatar where you're just plugging ponytails in,
Yeah.
plugging those braids in. He's like, that's what I do all day long, is I just hook people up to the beast. Nature's like that, and it's like people are like, oh, I'm in a city. Well, the funny thing about that is that if you happen to be outside in a city very late at night, like there are foxes moving through the city often, and there's a frog in a puddle, and there are these moments, there are birds that migrate through. There's all these places where the living world just comes through, and it's like you can you don't need a great deal of that access to be able to feel some of that quality, right? And so if you don't have a lot of nature around you, like get a plant, make a little altar with natural objects. It's like, how can you bring these kind of elemental forces? I mean, we're in California, so it's like a crystal, a rock shop. I'm just looking around my office here, like a piece of driftwood, a feather, these things that reconnect us to this deep kind of ancestral inheritance. You can bring that quality of just felt attention to a rock. I mean, I'm like out on the beach, and there's this green serpentine rock boulder, and so I bring it home, and it's like, okay, when I'm sitting at my computer, I can either look at things that are made by people, or I can look at this kind of beautiful rock, and when I just let my eyes rest on it, it has a shape that you could never like mathematically predict. No one could design it. It's just too interesting looking. It's just too strange, right? And like this quality of nature where once you start really looking at it closely, a feather, just even a simple feather, like you start realizing like, oh my gosh, like there's just so much there in that little simple thing. And I think that's another quality of the living world, is it kind of unfolds infinitely the more deeply you look into it. So, working with your hands, being outside, like, I mean, I'm on this kick about barefoot shoes recently because I think they're so useful.
Oh, wow.
Do you know what barefoot shoes are? Like where they have like a kind of a very thin technical sole.
Yeah.
I mean, barefoot is great. I'd rather be barefoot, but sometimes you're in places where, you can't be because there's broken glass or nails or whatever. It's not safe. But, barefoot shoe has a thin technical sole, and so you can really feel the ground through your feet. And there's something really profound about this, right? Like you have all of these nerve endings in the bottom of your feet. And, they're close to the hands. You also have a fractal map of the body, the same way that you do on the hands, and the surface of the ears. We know this from traditional Chinese medicine. You have that on the bottom of your feet. And so to kind of, have this, most people wearing shoes, it's like having mittens on all the time.
Yeah.
One of the most sensitive sensory organs, and you've covered it up. And so like barefoot shoes, it allows you to feel the earth, feel the ground. And then you walk outside and you can feel the difference between standing on soil versus asphalt, right? It becomes very clear, very tactile in the body. I'm super on that right now because it's a super simple way to feel more grounded, more connected to the earth. So less in the head, less in cognition.
That's great, because now again, you've unlocked something. I'm like, now it makes sense why the second and third time I went to the beach, I was like, I got to get my feet in that water. Okay. So again, most of my formative years were on the East Coast. We rarely went to the beach there, but whenever we did go to the beach, and I lived in a beach town for a long time, the water is much, much warmer over there. So when we moved to California, I didn't realize how cold the water was compared to East. So I never went in the water when I went on the beach trips with the kids. The kids, of course, they would, oh, it's cold. They had fun with that. I was like, that's not for me. I had a relative come visit. They hit that water. They never went back to the water. It was so cold. Second and third time I went to go visit the beach, I was like, I get my feet in this water. I was like, I know it's cold, but I got to get my feet in this water. And my family was like, are you crazy? I was like, I just have to get my feet in this water for some reason. And I did. Now, every time I go to the beach, I bring extra socks. I make sure I'm wearing certain types of pants that I can, zip up to the calves. And I go stand in that water for a good 5 minutes. And then I'm like, all right, that's all I needed to do. And I never knew why, but now now what you say makes a lot of sense. There's a connect about it. So it's almost like every time I go, there has to be a different kind of level of connection. Like, okay, now I've been to the beach. Let's get closer to the water. Let's go do this. Let's go do that. And I think even if you go to a community park and you sit by a tree, but instead of just sitting at the tree and dorking around on your phone, you sit at the tree and touch the tree. You look at the tree. How many roots are in this tree?
Yeah.
Ants crawling on this tree.
Yeah.
Doing that kind of thing, it seems like it's like what you're talking about, like having the bare feet. There's some weird, well, for me, it's weird, and probably for others, it's weird, but the more I talk to you, the more it makes sense. There is something that just grounds you just from doing something as simple as that.
Well, yeah. And this is, I think, the beautiful thing about attention. So when I think about mindfulness and the way that we deploy attention to increase restoration and well-being, you want to find a signal that nourishes the body. And then you want to really put your attention on it. And I can pretty much guarantee, because I do it myself, like you're talking about, if you step into like the water, the freezing cold water here, and it pulls your attention right down to your feet because it's so intense, right?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you're having this sensory experience that's very strong. The water's really cold. You're feeling the sand move under, if your tide is, you're feeling the sand move underneath you. And it's like sucking your attention down into your feet. And there's something that's like, you're getting the input, the sensory input from the water, you're getting the sand, you're getting the grounding, and then your attention is just right there with that, And so it's powerful. It's like all of a sudden you've just changed the current flowing through your body,
Yeah.
And your analogy, you go to the park and it's like, okay, cool, I can sit on the tree. But the moment that my attention really gets on the tree and I'm looking at the little ant running down the thing and I'm thinking about the roots, then my attention now is fortifying the nourishment that's coming in through the living world, right? And so our thing with mindfulness is find something that feels really good to you and then use the attention to juice that, fortify that,
Right.
And it doesn't have to be a big thing. This is where people are like, oh, restorative practice is self-care. It's, I don't have time, but these micro moments, like when you brew a cup of coffee, if you like the way coffee smells, take a really deep inhalation and super notice that,
Yes.
just these little moments, right? You're putting on, cologne or something, there's a moment of sensory pleasure, lean into it, really soak it in. And
even with coffee, I switched to making French press like years and years ago because a guy that was working for a major coffee company, he said, hey, we're thinking about putting a French press feature into ours. And I was like, well, what's that? And he said, well, I'll show you. And he said, here's how we normally do coffee. And then here's what French press takes. And it took like an extra 10 minutes. I'm like, who wants to do this? And he's like, and then you press it down and all the oils come out. I was like, who wants to do this? But the minute I smelled it and tasted it, I was like, I'm never going back. I said, if any chance I can make French press coffee, I will do that. And it's been years. I want to say I'm going on like year 8 of making French press coffee as many mornings as I can for that very reason, because it smells and just tastes different. It's just like it's something. It's not even for the caffeine anymore. It's just I don't put cream or sugar or anything. People, my kids think, how do you drink that? I was like, it's a different life, So, but something about that process, just something as simple as that. It was like, it's grounding in the morning. So, so how do we do this? And I don't think I thought about this question until now. I was like, so how do we translate those nature experiences of well-being? So let's say we engage in the wellness. We take one of, 2 or 3 of your 80 nature-based practices. How do we translate that into connectedness with other human beings at that point? Because, again, we've got folks out here that are going to be leaders. They're going to go from, I was really good in, let's use my profession as I was really good at doing therapy one-on-one with kids or whatever. But now that I'm a manager, now I have to supervise other people that do that. So my really being good at one-on-one therapy doesn't necessarily translate easily to how I get along with other therapists and how do I manage metrics and how do I keep that human connection going. So if that were someone like me, well, I'm not a manager, but if it's somebody that's been in that type of position where now they're in charge of working with other people, how do they translate these nature experiences into people experiences?
It's an interesting question, Paul. I mean, one of the things we do a lot in our work is we've developed a couple of different assessment tools. One of them is called the connection assessment. And it's a 42 question instrument. And it sort of just asks people, a question like, how much do you feel like your attention is in the present moment? And people can say, I disagree, I agree, I feel neutral about it, some range, right? How connected do you feel to your ancestors? How connected do you feel to nature? How easy is it for you to bounce back when you've had something difficult happen? And we just sort of help them build kind of a map, like a landscape of these different facets of connection. And, I think you can make an argument like, well, some people are going to be, I think we see like some people are like really have developed a lot of connection around relationships with other people, but maybe they haven't developed it so much around nature. Or some people are like really connected to themselves, but maybe not other people. Or, we've known people who are like super connected to like meditation and nature, but they're like, you don't want to hang out with them because they don't know how to be with people, And so everybody has, I think, different kind of landscapes, right? Different areas where they've either focused on connection or not. And, probably some of it is temperament, some of it is lifestyle, some of it is like, if you find a place to connect that's nourishing, you keep doing that and you get better at it. And so, I don't know. I think like there's certain elements of, connectedness that are sort of universal qualities that you can sort of apply. If I go out into nature and I feel really nature connected and I notice, wow, I'm out here and I'm noticing things more. We use this lens of tracking a lot. I'm out here, I'm tracking, I'm noticing the birds, I'm understanding what the turkeys are saying. Those tracking skills are applicable to humans. You're out there, you're tracking nonverbal stuff. You're tracking energy, you're tracking body language, you're tracking gesture and posture. You can apply all that to people. It may not be the same because, people aren't the same as the turkeys. I mean, I know some turkeys, but you know what I'm saying? But they're not the same as the animals, but those principles of tracking energy, of tracking flow, of tracking state, I think those things are applicable. I think, there are elements of attending to sensory experience that you can apply in your relationships, So I think some of it's very transferable. And I think some of it's, quite distinct, right? Like when I think about relationships, I think about managing, I think about relating across difference. I think about overcoming kind of disconnective tendencies. I think about how do you support and mentor people. And, certainly those are things that are connected to lessons that could come from nature, but, they're also distinct. And so I think, there's these different facets of this. I think a lot of our work is around restoring well-being, restoring access to connection. I think if you are more connected to yourself and you source that connection through nature, you come into relationships from a different place, And so for me, there's a level of it that's kind of that self-care level, which is about how do I fortify my own sense of safety and connection so that when I show up at work in my role, I'm available and I'm calm and I'm, able to kind of lean in and connect with people. There's kind of that self-care aspect of it.
Yes.
And then there is also like building the confidence and the kind of sense of your own agency and your own sort of ability to handle what needs to be handled and, address the variety of different responsibilities and roles that you have in a leadership role, and I don't know, I think there's these different kind of facets of it. How are we supported? John and I were talking about, he was really thinking of kind of deep nature awareness training as a training for leadership, because he says, people who are really nature connected, they become good listeners, they become in service to something larger. Right. And they start to embody these qualities of leadership. And I would direct your listeners, his organization is called the Tracking Project. And I think they do really beautiful work about developing leadership abilities through tracking, through these qualities of becoming like nature connected, a good tracker, a good listener. They're very connected. It's also, I think, very much a path of humility and service.
Yeah, I'm big on service leadership, and I'm big on empowerment, and I believe that being a good listener is the key to both, because um, it takes it's a different type of investment. We used to get in the military, just go to this training. The military is paid for this training. Go to this training. Go to this training. But we were there a lot of times to check boxes. Whereas if you're
Yes.
investing time and listening, sometimes you can get more quality out of taking the 10 or 15 minutes of extra time to just observe your employees, observe your colleagues, interact with them differently, listen, even if their answer is wrong, even if what they're doing is going in a wrong direction, even if it's going to be on paper unproductive, learning and listening how they got there and what brought them there and their decision making, you can find where the strengths were. And you can also find where the challenges were more out of that, having that type of interaction and observation than just saying you're wrong, get out of here and do it this way. And so I can see where the tracking element would be helpful. And there's, I think, I don't know if you feel this way, there's an unconscious bias for me because I'm in this type of field where my day-to-day job is to observe, is to deal with people and look at them differently. But that's not everybody that's listening here, and that's not every leadership position. But I think there's some elements of that can translate. So something like the whole tracking program, it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense to me, and I think it would definitely be beneficial to somebody else out there. Just like going in and learning, wow, there's 300 different ways in this book. What is it, like 900 years of experience combined that you listed? Something like that. When you
Well, yeah,
got all the
we have
people,
40 mentors and advisors.
40 mentors and
On well-being.
advisors
Yeah,
that, you know, there's a lot to choose from, that something's going to land somewhere and somebody go, oh man, I didn't think about that.
Yeah, if your audience is interested, the platform is at restorativepractices.com, and the book that you're speaking about is 300 Restorative Practices of Wellbeing. That's the kind of analog app to our learning platform. So
Right.
it's mapped to the platform. You read about a practice, and then if people want to see it taught, by one of our team, they can go there.
That's really cool.
But I'll tell you something interesting just briefly about tracking, which is that our focus on tracking actually emerged out of the data itself, out of the model, because we started to realize it was an intersectional point between self-care, relationships, and nature. And we coined a term, we kind of created a word to describe something that's both a metaphor, an activity, and a meditation. And the word is meditativity. And so we say that tracking is like a meditativity on the model. And it's because we think about, tracking, and there's this kind of nature awareness sense of hard ground tracking as a survival skill, being able to track animals. And we think about it like internally in terms of self-care, like when I'm meditating, I'm really tracking myself. I think as a leader, you're always tracking. You're tracking clients, you're tracking the market, you're tracking all of these things to find a pathway to move through.
Right. Well, let's say, because if you have like a very clear vision as to where you're going, everything you're tracking is going to lead towards that vision. So yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, and you have to bring, the observational skills, you bring the awareness skills, and you have to have that, sense of being guided by that mission, that vision, and that heart for it, And, it's like this, I think we're really at this time where we need people who are connected to their hearts. We need people who are pursuing big dreams and bringing things into service of those. And something that a lot of my mentors have always said to me is if your heart is really in something fully, your passion, your heart, you're in service to something that's bigger than you, and you make yourself useful and you carry yourself and conduct yourself with humility, then nature itself will line up and support you.
Oh, wow.
And it's been my experience. I think it's the design of things here, man.
Yeah. That's really cool. The universe will start to work towards you in a sense, American vision of what universe is. But yeah, I tell kids that I've mentored before, is like, luck is really just preparation and an opportunity coming together is what it is. And the more you do something, you get ready for it. When the opportunity comes, you're going to be ready for it. And if you're passionate about something, you'll keep doing it. And I've worked with a young guy before, he was really good with like setting up cameras and videos and everything. I was like, how did you do this? He's like, I've been doing this in school. I said, what's your dream? He's like, well, I want to direct big films. He said, but it's a really hard business to get into. I said, well, how do you get into it? He's like, well, you just got to keep directing films. He goes, but I can't see me doing that now. I said, dude, there's a whole market. There's little things. I said, there's so many more avenues now that you keep doing the little things. You keep putting in reps. You keep, go out and video trees, go do some, real estate work, videoing, some little stuff. I said, over time, those reps are going to come together and there's going to be that opportunity. And that one will lead to the next one. The next one is, if you really want to do this, just keep doing something with it, is what I told him. And he just kind of looked at me. He's like, oh, okay, I guess it makes sense. And he's really young. So I'm hoping that sort of thing sticks. But it makes sense what you're saying. Like, if your heart is really into something, the nature will eventually connect to you and get you where you need to go.
It's a relationship, it goes both directions. And yeah, it's beautiful what you're saying. I think like you work in that direction and you keep decreasing the distance between your dream and how things show up, and you just keep following, that path. This path that we're on, I've been following for 25 years, and it's
wow.
How
did you start
it's been
that?
A long
That's supposed to be my first question. But I was like,
right.
How did you get there? Because, it was like, how did you go from this is what I want to do from whatever it was you were doing before, 25 years before?
Well, I think I had a pretty deep sense even in college. So I'm 45. I remember being 19 years old. I think I just had a really deep sense that the way our civilization was moving felt really upside down to me, and I don't think I knew even what I meant by that, but simply that like we had to find another way forward, and that somehow that other way forward was also a way back to something much older,
Yeah.
And I think my path has been very non-linear, not obvious. The work that I do now, the field that we're developing, it didn't exist when I was in college. So when I am talking to younger people, it's like, I remember feeling totally overwhelmed in college. Like, how do I pick a major and like, what direction? And it's interesting looking back, because clearly I couldn't have, because the work I do now, the field didn't exist when I was in college. And I think it's important for young people to realize that we're in a world that's changing rapidly, and there are emerging both problems and solutions that, weren't there years ago. And so young people today, they're going to have an opportunity landscape that's very different. And so I think if you learn to trust the compass of your heart and you steer toward what you feel most passionate about, it will lead you in a good way.
Yeah.
And, even if you don't know what that is, I think if I had a courage in myself, it was to trust that even if I didn't know why something would be useful, if I felt passionate strongly enough about it, deep enough about it, it was worth pursuing. Really good advice for anyone really who's doing anything, but for young people especially, like, find people who you want to be like in a future version of yourself.
Oh yeah. Good.
Find mentors, find people who you're like, wow, I admire that person. I want to learn from them. And then like put yourself in service to them.
Yeah.
That's a great way to develop. And it's, this is, I think, again, like a failure of modern education. Like we, for our ancestry, always had like elders, and, we were always apprenticing to people, whether it was a hunter in the village who was really good at, this, or somebody weaving baskets. Like we were always working relationally with people at different developmental stages to help us move forward. And, most people don't have these kind of apprenticeships anymore, but make yourself useful to somebody who you want to be like, and then you'll learn with them, and you'll develop a relationship with them, and you'll get to see them in their lives and how they're solving challenges. And, somebody will realize like, wow, I learned that, from somebody 20 years ago. I didn't even realize I was learning.
Yeah. I mean, you're only 2 years younger than me. And, one of my jokes with other friends that know you is like, everything I've done with my meditations and my mental health classes, I stole from Gabriel. So I said, no, I've had maybe 6 or 7 classes with you, but the pieces that I pulled out of those classes were like, oh my gosh, I didn't know this was that cool. How do I use this for somebody else? And so I've taken some things and I've learned so many things from you, just because you've had your experiences since you were 19 of getting to where you are. It's like those little bits and pieces fit into my guided meditations. Those bits and pieces fit into me teaching folks in my church how mental health works in relation to how we were created, how we believe we were created, and the nervous systems and how everything is developed. And just being able to put that in a language is like, I wouldn't have been able to do this had I not been in some of Gabriel's classes. I wouldn't know how to communicate the best way to do some box breathing just to get in a little bit of extra oxygen to relax yourself. I hadn't had those classes. So a lot of things, it's experiences with other people. It's not necessarily the gatekeepers. It's not necessarily the you have to do this, you have to do that. You have to check all these boxes to be in this place, to be able to serve somebody.
I appreciate that, man. Thanks for saying that. And you can't steal it because it doesn't belong to me, and it's given, right?
Yeah.
But it didn't come from me. It's because I've had the good fortune to have 40 mentors who paid it forward to me, and so I get to pay it forward now as well. So and it's an honor to be useful, to you and to your listeners. And I wish you and I continued opportunities to connect and play and grow together. And I wish your listeners benefit from this episode.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this conversation. Thanks again for wanting to be a part of this episode and giving your knowledge and a lot of your time so that we can help people learn how to lead with a lot less stress and more success, for sure.
Right on, brother. It's an honor.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Bright Insights. For more information on how to have less stress and more success, visit brightinsightsmedia.com.
If you enjoyed this episode in particular, or the Bright Insights podcast overall, subscribe and share with your friends. That gives us a little more visibility. And with that, we can all have less stress and more success.
Tramp Loop Media.